So Philippe is a scientific director at the Station Biologique de Roscoff, which is one of the biggest European center for seaweed research. He has like 30, 40 years experience of seaweed. You know, eating seaweed makes you look young. And he's one of the best scientists once again. So Philippe, tell us why science is so important and what are the biggest challenge for science?
Thank you, Vincent, and hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about science behind what we are willing to develop in terms of scaling up the potential of seaweed worldwide. So, because without this strong basis, we will be unable to really cope with all the challenges we are facing. So science was at the origin of the potential of developing the consumption of seaweeds in Asia. In fact, until the Second World War, the cultivation of seaweeds was not such much developed in Asian countries like Japan or China or Korea. It developed when the farmers, which were just coping with some natural recruitment from wild seedlings which were settling on rocks or on bamboos, were just able to produce very small amount of productions. And then when they discovered the potential of domesticating the seaweed species by controlling, by really being able to control their life cycles, how to really produce large amount of seedlings, they were able to develop an industry. First in China, to address a very important challenge at that time in China, which was the iodine deficiency in the populations, especially in far remote places in China. They developed the large-scale cultivation of kombu from nothing, because the species was not originating from China. They imported some cultivars, in fact, from Japan and also Russia, to develop a new industry and to cultivate a crop which has allowed to provide sufficient amount of iodine for the population. Similarly, in Japan, they developed the industrial cultivation of nori, which provide, of course, the seaweed sheet. You all know, wrapping the sushi maki. And the development of the cultivation of nori was not only in Japan, but also it started later on in Korea, both the North and South Korea. And it increased very importantly during the last 30 years, from nearly nothing about 30 years ago. And then South Korea is the second player in this region, in fact, in front of Japan. So that means there is a potential really to develop the cultivation of seaweed if it is strongly based on the knowledge of the domestication of the species. And by this domestication, it is not only a matter of controlling the reproduction and to produce seedlings, it's also to be able to select the most suitable varieties in terms of course, potential for productivity, but also for the suitable uses, and especially when you are dealing with food, to have the most nutritious seaweed as possible.
And talking about reproduction, what are the various ways for seaweed to reproduce? I'm sure people are...
Basically, there is two ways of reproduction. One is based on sexual reproduction, like we are doing. That it's an important way of reproduction, which in fact prevent some genetic drift from is the best way to preserve the potential of growth. But you have also another mean, which is asexual, which could be by reproductive cells, which will not, in fact, cross-fertilize. But you have also the potential, like you are probably doing with some green plants at home or in your garden, just by propagating seaweeds by propagules, just by cutting some pieces of seaweeds and then letting them grow again. That is the case for several groups of species, like in the green seaweed, the sea lettuce, but also in the red seaweed, a lot of tropical red seaweeds, which are in fact essentially propagated using this way.
So tell us what is a seaweed? I mean, how would you describe a seaweed, and what is not a seaweed as well? Because there's always some confusion about that.
Yeah. As you introduced previously, Vincent, the seaweeds are algae, so they belong to the group of algae, which in fact encompass a lot of different lineages of microscopic algae, which are mainly represented in the plankton, both in the ocean and in fresh water. And, but the appearance of the multicellularity has only occurred in a few lineages among the living trees, including in 3 groups of algae: the green, as you mentioned, the red, and the brown. And the other groups, which are in fact developing multicellularity, are the animals and the fungi. They are the only group of organisms on Earth which are really able to do that. And so seaweeds are really the representative of the multicellular algae, and they have developed, of course, based on this multicellularity, a lot of traits which are specific, which provide new potential for in terms of chemical composition of these seaweeds, because they have to develop, for example, an envelope around their cells, which is quite similar to the extracellular matrix, which is surrounding our cells, and which is very important for cell communication, for cell integrity, and but also for defense mechanisms, for the immunity of seaweeds. So there is plenty of specificity, which provide, in fact, all the qualities we are now exploiting in seaweeds, which are providing very nice fibers, which of course could act as prebiotic, but also as very interesting ingredients for the field of packaging, as you exemplified. But also a lot of vitamins, which could be specific to some groups, or some other small molecules which were used as signaling molecules first, and which are very important molecules which other activities in other organisms.
And spirulina is not seaweed, and Posidonia is not seaweed. So tell us about it.
Spirulina is in fact, it's a bacteria. But as you mentioned, the spirulina belongs to a group of so-called blue bacteria, the cyanobacteria, which are the most ancient photosynthetic organisms on Earth. They appeared about 3.5 billion years ago, and they are at the origin of photosynthetic organisms on Earth. So they are a very important group, but of course in cyanobacteria they do not develop a true multicellularity. They can group individual cells, but so they are completely different for the much more evolved
seagrass
algae. And seagrass are in fact terrestrial plants, which reconquer the marine environment. They belong to a family which first evolved as all land plants on Earth, and which probably through the changes in the level of the sea has to cope with the elevation of this level, and has evolved the potential to adapt to the seawater environment. It's completely now a group which is exclusively found in seawater.
Yeah, and it has roots, and seaweed has no roots.
And it has roots, and it has flowers. It will also produce pollen grains for fertilization of female organs, so that means they are completely similar to terrestrial plants in terms of reproduction.
So if you see flowers and roots, it's not a seaweed. That's the key learning here.
That's key learning.
I mean, the most important question maybe of all, I mean, you are working in the domestication and trying to, and for sure when we hear about domestication, too often we hear exploitation. So how can we avoid the pitfall that we had with land agriculture, with GMO, with industrial farming, with monoculture? How can we avoid that, and how can we make sure that growing seaweed at scale will not impact negatively the environment?
I think we have to consider that the way that the seaweed cultivation was developed in Asia and in Southeast Asia, it was based on the small holders, in fact, which were sometimes fishermen which were just willing to develop other businesses, and which were forced sometimes to develop other businesses to survive, and which were which started to grow seaweeds on small areas, and then progressively group in some form of cooperatives, which were well organized. And we have very good examples in Japan of this organization, which has allowed to scale up the farms and to provide some mechanization for the farmers, and also some improvement in the processing.
But can it be dangerous for the environment?
In fact, the seaweed cultivation basically is not dangerous for the environment, except if you are playing with the seaweed biodiversity and by transferring some seaweed from a place of the world to another one. And we have done that in the past. Yeah. But we know our responsibility now facing the loss of biodiversity worldwide, that it is no longer possible to do that, and we have to rely on the local genetic diversity of seaweed, which is huge, in fact, and which is poorly studied in many areas of the world at the moment, but which is, in fact, providing a lot of resources. And if we can exploit that and we can grow seaweeds on a reasonable scale, we will provide services which sometimes are disappearing in the ocean. So we have some areas where there is an excess of nutrients coming from the rivers, excess nitrogens and phosphorus, and seaweeds are growing proliferating in these areas. Like we have the case of green tides in Brittany, but also the bad examples of sargassum proliferating in the Caribbean. So we know that to re-equilibrate these ecosystems, we have to help these ecosystems to restore the potential of growing seaweeds in these ecosystems. And we will, of course, remediate to the excess of nutrients, but we will also provide additional services, like by the photosynthesis, reducing the acidification of the oceans in this area, which is increasing due to the lack of, to increase of CO2 capture by the ocean. And also, of course, we will provide some new niches for the biodiversity by providing habitats and food for animals. We will also have some restoration of food ecosystems. And that we have a few examples of this restoration, which is sometimes not operated directly by cultivation, but which involves some cultivation or domestication, because when you are transplanting, for example, some seaweeds in a place to restore plants which have disappeared, it is a matter of beginning of the domestication. So that could be done by pure artificial cultivation, but also by just using aquaculture to provide seedlings for the restoration.